and welcome to week 7 of our life group series, working through the book of Ecclesiastes together. The theme for our study has been living life backwards. What does it look like to think about the end from the beginning and seek to ask, God, how can I live a life that honors you well? In fact, we're going to talk about that even more explicitly in our text this afternoon or this evening or whenever you're watching this video together with your life groups. We only have a few weeks left in our winter session for life groups, and so I want to encourage you, keep plugging, keep being faithful over these next few weeks together, and thank you once again to our life group leaders for your dedication in serving our Lord through this ministry. It's a reminder to us of our discipleship pathway. We worship, we connect with each other in life groups, in classes, and in different ways so that we could form a community that seeks to know and follow the Lord more faithfully. And so this is an important part of your discipleship as an individual, growing in small groups. We believe that transformation doesn't just happen in rows on a Sunday, but in circles throughout the week. But today, as we're looking into Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we're talking about embracing the truth that life has its limitations. Life has its limits, and that we could look at these limits as something that is impeding us from joy, or we could look at the limits of life as we look forward, as we look back, and as we look towards the present as a gift from God to teach us what it means to live well and to love what God gives us during the limited times and experiences of our life to better honor Him. Embracing limits. Boundaries. Now, perhaps you've heard that word, boundaries, oftentimes used. You use it when you're raising your kids, right? That you set healthy boundaries. Boundaries as well as you're driving on the road. We talked about this a little bit on Sunday, how the limits of the lines on the road are supposed to protect you. That crossing over those limits, crossing over those boundaries are when we start to find ourselves in trouble. In the same way in our lives are given to us as a gift from God, and the limits we are experiencing, the boundaries we are experiencing are actually opportunities for us to flourish as we seek to know and follow God. And we'll tie it in as well at the end about the gospel, and especially in Galatians, how freedom in Christ does not mean the ability to do whatever it is we want, but to live more faithfully in a way that most honors God. So we talked about at least 3 ways of looking at limits together in our text. We talked about looking back, how looking back towards the past, nostalgia, we'll end with that. We talked about in the present, looking for the ability to be calm and content, the limits that come with that. And then as well towards the future. And if you remember, we talked about that. This text, it's really a text we often see heard and used at funerals, because it has this shocking kind of statement about the way we are to support and encourage ourselves in moments when we're in our greatest points of grief and sadness in the face of death. Once again, verse 1 and 2 and 3. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, since that is the end of all mankind, and the living should take it to heart. Grief is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be glad. What does this mean? Here in the text, it says that a day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Now, I don't know about you, but when my kids were born, that was a great celebration day. We send out texts, we send out cards, we gave out gifts. It was a great day of celebration, but the wisdom here in Ecclesiastes tell us that one's death is actually a better day. And it's actually better to go to the house of mourning, to a funeral, than it is to a house of feasting. Why? At the end of verse 2, we see the reason. It says, since that is the end of all mankind, and the living should take it to heart. Here's the idea, that when you find yourself at a funeral, you're asking yourself the real deep questions of life. How did this person live? What things did they celebrate? What was it about their life that you could look to and point and say, wow, look at their accomplishments, or look at the way they treated others? It's supposed to make us think to our own selves, how am I living today? The living take it to heart. What do I want to be written for my obituary. That's the idea here in these verses. That looking backwards and looking forwards and recognizing that one day in the future we will die, it actually liberates us to live better today. And when we go to a place of mourning, we should be mindful. All of us have been at funerals, and sometimes it's an individual that maybe didn't always live life the best way they should have. Maybe there's a lot of people that they hurt. And at a funeral, you may hear people praising this person for their life and the things they did, and you think to yourself, yeah, but I know the real story. It's a reminder to us that, in the end, all things become known, and how am I truly living my life? It's better to go to the house of mourning. The living get to take it to heart. So the reality of death is there for all of us as we look forward. Our life has a limit, has a boundary, has a time frame. How am I living today? Are you living in such a way today that at your death, those who come to mourn will celebrate the life you lived to follow after God? As well, when we go to a place of mourning, we're reminded that all of us fall and that none of us have lived a perfect life. And it should remind us of God's grace and our forgiveness that we find in Him, if you know Jesus. As well, it should remind us that sin and death in this world oftentimes seem to have the final say, but that the one who knows Jesus has hope eternal. So we look forward to the limitation of our own very life, and we ask God, how can I live in a way today that honors you in response to the good news of the gospel I've received? Secondly, we talked about looking at today, looking at the current day, and we talked about these two ways of embracing contentment and seeking to be a person of peace and calm. It says in verse 7, surely the practice of extortion, turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the mind. Why does someone want to extort others? Why might someone want to bribe others? Because they want something that they don't currently have. Whatever it might be. More money, more power, more influence, bribery, extortion, the great extreme examples of taking what is not yours. It reveals a condition in our heart of a lack of contentment with what God has given us. The follower of God, the believer in Jesus Christ, should be an example of peace and contentment because we have received the great gift of salvation. We don't have to claw after things that are not our own. The limits of what we have in this world are actually a blessing from God in how we live. Then secondly, it talks about being calm. It says, the end of a matter is better than the beginning. A patient spirit is better than a proud spirit. Don't let your spirit rush to be angry, for anger abides in the heart of fools. Calm, peace, waiting for a matter to work its way out. Being at peace with the limitation of seeing things always the way we want it. We got to recognize that things don't always come the way we want it in the time frame in which we want it. That oftentimes you and I get angered when things are not going our way. It says here, don't let your spirit rush to be angry. Once again, understanding the gospel really helps frame this for us. The gospel reminds us that this world we are in has all been touched by the effects of sin. That the world is still experiencing these pains as it groans for the redemptions of the sons and daughters of God. That the world around us is broken and flawed. And some of us are so impatient. We're not people of calm and peace because we expect everything to be right now. And if we live that kind of life, not understanding the limit of not things going the way we want them to be in our time frame, then we'll be a person of discontentment. Are you a person like this? When you look to the current day, are you content with what God has given you and calm even in the face of the pain and difficulties and unanswered prayers? Do not rush to anger. Be a person of peace. You can lament as a person of peace. You can mourn as a person of peace, and also you could give God the glory as you trust Him to work things out. What are you waiting for today that you need to trust that God's doing something in his time. And then lastly, maybe you're the limitation of the future. You say, okay, I recognize I'm going to die. I want to make better decisions. You may even say, today, I want to make sure, God, help me to be a person of peace and contentment and thankfulness and not anger. But as well, it says here to be weary of looking too over emotionally and fondly of the past. Look what it says. It says, don't say, why were the former days better than these? Since it is not wise of you to ask this. Being overly nostalgic for a time past and wanting to recreate it in the current way as well is not embracing the limits of our time on this earth. Recognizing that just because something happened in the past in a way we desired and wanted doesn't mean that that was better. It just meant that maybe that season had more blessings or not in your life. But even if you recreated those events of the past, even if you went to that nostalgia, as we talked about on Sunday, to that nostalgic place that brought about some excitement about things in your youth, perhaps a family vacation, another spot. Even if you were at those places today, it would not be the same as it was back then. I shared the story of going with my parents to a place that they loved as growing up and as a young couple to celebrate. And we went to the same place, same location, and it was run down, and it wasn't good to look at, and it did not make us happy. Why? Because when we try to recreate the past, it reminds us that our longing is not just for those events in those places, but for those times that remind us that all of us have eternity in our hearts. In fact, when we look back and are nostalgic, it should gear our hearts to long for heaven on earth, a time when we will truly experience peace and longing with him. It's not just about recreating events and moments. It's looking at some of those highs and saying, God, those glimpses reminded me of the time yet to come. As followers of Jesus, remember, he has put eternity in our hearts. And the gospel, we ended this way, that the gospel is this wonderful invitation from the Lord to live in freedom, as it talks about in Galatians. To live in freedom, but the freedom itself has limits. That we don't just get to choose and live the way we want, but that the freedom that comes from God enables us to live a life of true satisfaction and obedience to God. Embrace the limits in your life. Learn to love the recognition and the truth that our life will end. Learn to love and embrace the limit that God allows us to be content with what we have and be people of peace. And even that limitation of not being able to recreate the past, it should place within us a hunger for a day yet to come. Follower of Jesus, in the fallen world we are in, we will come face to face with boundaries and the limits of our time and our place. And the wisdom of God says, seek to live in a way that honors me, no matter what limitation you may be experiencing. Because when you do, your purpose of eternity takes priority in our life.